Hello everybody. In this Paratext presentation, I want to take a look at two different editions of J.G. Ballard's Crash. First, the Pinnacle Books edition from 1974, and then the Movie Tie-in edition published by Noonday Press in 1996. I specifically want to focus on how the paratext of each emphasizes different aspects of Ballard's novel. Before jumping into the paratexts, here's a little background on the novel's production. According to a thorough article by Mike Holliday published on Ballardian.com, which is a website completely dedicated to all things Ballard, Crash wasn't the first time that Ballard played around with the idea of mixing the erotic and the automobile. As Holliday states, the novel was actually several years in the making, with many of its ideas first appearing in Ballard's work during the previous decade. Holliday goes on to mention Ballard's 1970 collection, The Atrocity Exhibition, as one of those works. Interestingly enough, part of Ballard's story, You and Me in the Continuum, was used in director Harley Coklas's 1971 short film called Crash, in which Ballard appears and reads his description of a violent car crash, much like the one featured in his 1973 novel. Some other important influences were Ballard's observations about the public's reaction to contemporary images of war and destruction, namely the JFK assassination and the Vietnam War. Instead of being horrified by these images, the public seemed to be fascinated by them. Another influence is the early 20th century futurist artistic movement, which sung the praises of modernity and specifically the speed offered by cars, praising it to an almost sexualized, fetishized extent. Freud also served as an influence, specifically his idea of the death drive, which is a fitting name given the content of Ballard's novel. And finally, Ballard's friendship with psychologist Christopher Evans helped him work out the details of what is referred to in the novel as the mysterious eroticism of wounds. In 1971, Ballard and Evans even wrote a never-performed play called Crash, but more on that later. The first covers from the Pinnacle Books edition published in 1974, just 1 year after the initial hardcover releases in the UK and the United States. The most obvious paratext here is the car, which I'll refer to as the car as woman as penis driven by man. This image focuses on the relationship between the pleasure of sex and the pain of death, a similar concept to the eroticism of wounds. It's clear from this image that the car isn't just a mode of transportation, but a mode of sexual gratification. And underneath it all, and very obvious in the plot concerning Vaughn's death, the man behind the wheel is Freud's death drive. And you can read more about Freud's death drive at the bottom of the screen, compliments of an article written by Joanne Faulkner and published in Minerva, an Internet Journal of Philosophy. This description is precisely the process that Vaughn and eventually James undergoes, culminating in his death performance. At the beginning of the novel, James reflects on the screenings Vaughn used to hold where he'd project footage of car crashes, and James mentions that, quote, "The repeated sequences of crashing cars first calmed and then aroused me. Cruising alone on the motorway under the yellow glare of the sodium lights, I thought of myself at the controls of these impacting vehicles," end quote. Just as Freud's death drive revs up through repetition, eventually stripping the analysand of autonomy, Vaughn exposes James to car crashes until he ends up as the man behind the wheel, driving to his own death. In addition to the Freudian appeal, this also gives a nod to the futurist movement of the early 20th century. Founded by Filippo Marinetti, it was a movement concerned with embracing all things modern, particularly machines, and specifically cars. Marinetti writes the quote at the bottom of the screen in his 1909 work, The Founding and Manifesto of Futurism. Already there is the emphasis on the beauty in the automobile, and maybe even a bit of Freudian sexualization with the description of its pipes. The colors radiating the shapes of the car, as well as its perspective on the cover, speak to this idea of movement. The car isn't static on the cover, but rather rushing forward. It looks like the woman's hair is blowing in the wind. The man seems hunched forward over the steering wheel, racing to his ultimate sexual death. But Vaughn and his followers aren't amateurs. Just like Marinetti and his futurists, Vaughn is an artist who studies his craft, collects countless images of videos of accidents, and even goes so far as to recreate the positions of dead bodies while having sex in the backseat of a car. Vaughn's art is an extreme version of futurism and a full embrace of what the automobile can offer. Moving forward a decade and a half, we get this cover on the 1996 Movie Tie-in edition published by Noonday Press. This was released to coincide with the film adaptation directed by David Cronenberg of Scanners and Videodrome fame. The film starred Holly Hunter, James Spader, Elias Koteas, and Deborah Kara Unger, all pictured on the top of the cover. The film, like its source material, received mixed reactions, and the film was the subject of a famous exchange between Ebert and Roper on an episode of At the Movies. Roper despised the film, calling the ideas in it a bunch of hooey, whereas Ebert comes to its defense, explaining, as you can see on the quote, how Cronenberg uses the pornographic form to show the mechanism of human compulsion and obsession. But what's most significant here is the composition of the images on the cover. The naked woman with the Crash Test logo serving as censorship, and the red-tinted faces peering over her. Just as the Pinnacle cover hints at mixing pleasure and pain, this does as well, with the naked woman with her head thrown back being covered as if she were a crash test dummy. What makes me call this cover an image from a never-performed play is that the image of the faces at the top. The Crash play that Ballard and Evans wrote was supposed to end, according to Holliday's article on Ballardian.com, with, quote, film footage of a cinema audience looking up at the screen, end quote, in effect making the audience look upon themselves. Holliday ultimately argues that, quote, by setting the play in terms of an ordinary family together with the reflexive ending, Ballard makes it clear that his concerns are not specifically with the psychotic or the traumatized, but with all of us, end quote. The faces at the top of the cover literally represent the characters, but they figuratively represent society's fascination with death and destruction. This idea is brought up in the novel at the beginning when James reflects on Vaughn's death and says, quote, we will leave with the others who gather around him like a crowd drawn to an injured cripple whose deformed postures reveal the secret formulas of their minds and lives, end quote. And this idea comes up again after the accident with the taxi, Italian sports car, and black limousine when James notes, quote, hundreds of spectators and likens them to, quote, members of a congregation leaving after a sermon urging us to celebrate our sexualities, end quote. All of this is to say, as the image on the cover suggests, that this is a public eroticism. Though it might be sexual, it isn't private, and though normal people might not consider themselves to be part of it, their presence says otherwise. So to wrap things up, each cover is advertising the same novel, but emphasizes different aspects of it. The 1974 Pinnacle Books edition focuses on the Freudian and futurist, with its radiating imagery of the car as woman as penis driven by man. As a means to advertise Cronenberg's film adaptation, the designers at the Noonday Press created an image reminiscent of an idea Ballard never got to perform on stage himself, emphasizing the fact that, though the book's eroticism of wounds might seem like a fringe fetish, it's one that attracts normal people. And that is where I'll leave things. Here are the URLs of the sources I cited in this presentation if you find yourself wanting more information about any of the topics I discussed. Thanks for taking the time to listen.